Hello everyone, and welcome back to the long-awaited 4th episode of KSP Arc. We left off in the last episode having sent our first probe to Minmus, and having unlocked the advanced rocketry tech. This gives us access to several important parts, including a larger fuel tank, and the very efficient LV-909 Terrier upper stage engine. Today we're going to use these new parts to experiment on our Kerbals and expand our robotic exploration of Kerbin's minty moon. The first order of business is the orbital endurance contract we wanted to do last episode but didn't quite have the resources for. We need to keep a Kerbal in orbit for 30 Kerbin days, or 60 days by KSP's default 6-hour measure. We're still using our weird 2 SRB stage design, with this rocket having the fins on the middle stage so we can keep them around until higher up in the atmosphere. By swapping out 2 smaller fuel tanks for one of the tanks we just unlocked and utilizing our newly available very efficient Terrier engine, we finally have an orbit-capable craft with enough hydrogen and oxygen to run the fuel cell, keeping Jebediah alive for 60 days. It's a bit weird to think about the fuel cell providing water for the Kerbals to drink. It would do that, and the water wouldn't be poisonous or anything, but it wouldn't have any of the nutrients or goodies you usually find in Earth water that are important for your body. I guess Kerbals are just built different, or maybe Jeb has like a big packet of the stuff he sprinkles into his drink like Kool-Aid. Once we're in orbit, we're going to head back into the tracking station to use some fast time warp without forcing the computer to try to render the planet and all of its clouds as we spin around it every few seconds. This mission really came down to the wire in terms of life support. I don't know if it was just the display that was off or if there was some issue with how fast resources were consumed with the time warp, but Jeb's 36 hours of oxygen towards the end seemed to last a lot longer than 36 hours. Regardless, on year 1, day 68, we have completed our contract, and Jeb can come home after having netted us 60,000 funds and 15 science. Once Jeb is back on terra firma, we set our sights once again on the mysterious moon of Minmus. We earlier activated a Minmus probes contract to set down 3 probes in different biomes on the surface of Minmus, which, in addition to earning the space program funds for its completion, gives us the opportunity to generate a wealth of science points. Using these points to unlock the electrics tech would provide access to basic solar panels, which would greatly improve the capabilities of the space program, as we would no longer be limited to bulky hydrogen fuel cell setups with finite lifespans to power our spacecraft. The first mission I wanted to try was a sample return of experiments from space around Minmus. I constructed a craft, again using our newly unlocked parts, which would be capable of controlled spaceflight to guarantee a return to Kerbin from space around Minmus. The first stage uses 2 Thumper SRBs strapped together, similar to the original Minmus probe. The main differences are in the second and upper stage. Since we're now much less constrained by the number of small fuel tanks necessary, the second stage consists of 2 FLT-400 tanks and 1 FLT-200 tank for a total of 1,000 units of propellant, driven by the swivel engine for its combination of thrust and strong gimbaling. Finally, the upper stage, containing the payload, contains a combined 600 units of propellant and is driven again by the Terrier engine with its low mass and high efficiency. After heading into the tracking station to warp until the launch site is close to where Minmus crosses the equator, we can go ahead with our launch. I've started to much more frequently use the tracking station to time warp to the launch window, as it's easier to look around and move the view with Kerbin being centered by default and without the game actively trying to manage having a vessel loaded. Also, you can then revert to launch or revert to the VAB without having to set up your launch window all over again. The payload on this craft consists of a Science Junior, mystery goo container, and supporting equipment including a fuel cell and its related tanks, as well as an antenna. The very top of the rocket has a detachable stage with a heat shield and parachute, which is responsible for returning a sample container to the ground safely. The launch went as expected, and once in orbit, the vessel has 1,722 meters per second of delta V remaining, which should be more than enough for what we have planned. From preliminary flight planning, the ejection should take about 15-14 meters per second of delta V, followed by a 7 meters per second course correction en route to Minmus, and a 23 meter per second course correction in space near Minmus to put us on course to enter Kerbin's atmosphere. Once in space around Minmus, it's a matter of enabling the Science Junior and Mystery Goo container modules for the duration of our time near this big green rock. By the time all of the available sample material has been expended, we are already on course to re-enter Kerbin's atmosphere, and we simply have to transfer these samples into the storage container. I'm not sure if this is a new mechanic since I recently reinstalled the game and all the mods on a new system, but you actually have to toggle a difficulty option to enable sample transfers on unmanned vessels. I enabled it for this mission, but I'm actually a bit torn on whether to leave it that way, because it honestly makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, I feel like conducting sample return missions with specialized craft should be allowed without having to return all of the experiment modules themselves from time to time. I'll have to think about it and see. Re-entry was pretty straightforward, but I had to tweak the pressure deployment point on the parachute as we don't have access to the Action Groups menu, which is how you normally modify the parachutes with Real Shoot in the VAB. After recovery of the sample return module, we're left with 78.5 science, which is just shy of what we need for the electrics tech. We'll have to use fuel cells to power some basic Minmus probes, but since we just need the probes to send over data for a few quick experiments, it shouldn't be nearly as much of an issue as with our manned endurance contract. Also, after finishing the sample return, there was a new contract available to transmit or recover science from the surface of Minmus, which is a perfect opportunity, seeing as I was planning to do that next anyway. The design I came up with consists of a very simple upper stage with just a probe core, the bare minimum supporting equipment, landing gear, and 3 experiments. The telemetry report and thermometer are modules inside the probe core, and the Geiger counter is mounted externally. It doesn't seem like much, but the tiny mass of the actual payload in comparison to the fuel tanks gives this stage in excess of 3,000 meters per second of delta V. The remainder of the craft is a bit more conventional than some of the previous rockets we've used. The middle stage is a liquid-fueled stage running on a swivel, and the launch stage is just a thumper SRB with some fins strapped on the side. Not going to go too deep into the launch of this craft since it's pretty similar to what we just did, but suffice to say the probe made it into low Kerbin orbit with about 2,400 meters per second of delta V remaining, which should be more than enough. The ejection left us on a course for a slightly wonky Minmus intercept, but that's honestly fine because an inclined orbit provides a few more choices for what biome you want to land in. I also at this point figured out what the declutter map button is in Principia, which I suppose they added sometime between now and when I put this mod list together on my old computer a while back. It's quite helpful, although I'm frankly still not sure what the deal is with the flickering. I find that kind of annoying. As we enter Minmus's sphere of influence, we do a slight course correction to raise the periapsis above the ground, and when we make our closest approach, we start burning retrograde directly down to the surface. You may recall that I thought I disabled the random ignition failures in Kerbalism, at least the genuinely completely random ones. I did some digging around in config files later and did find what I believe to be the relevant settings and tweaked them appropriately, so I'll have to wait and see if that worked. The engine cut out at a very inopportune time, but thanks to Minmus's low gravity and some remarkably strong landing legs, the probe made it to the ground in one piece. Whoever machined those springs in the factory probably deserves a raise. Now, the astute among you may have noticed that this probe's connection to the Space Center has been fairly poor ever since we started to get out away from Kerbin. I thought that I could get away with using the rinky-dink Communitron antenna, but to my dismay, when I looked at the data status in Kerbalism, the craft was transmitting at a fraction of a byte per second, at which rate it will take months to send all of its data back. Depending on how you look at it, this either fortunately or unfortunately means another mission is on the cards. This craft is the exact same as the previous. The only difference is that the omnidirectional antenna has been swapped out for this high-gain antenna, which is strong enough to keep its connection to Kerbin all the way out at Minmus with the level 1 tracking station. The launch and transfer to Minmus went pretty much the same as the last mission again, so I'm not going to go over them in tremendous detail, other than to say I will definitely be making more use of this decluttering button, which is a fantastic feature. I've been annoyed for a long time with seeing the orbit lines of all the other Celestials when trying to plan things in the map view, and that button pretty much solves the problem. We again go into a very inclined Minmus approach, but rather than go straight into a descent, we instead capture the craft in orbit around Minmus for a short while. I thought that the high-gain antenna was a relay antenna, and indeed it did seem to be connecting to the probe we already have on the ground, but it didn't seem to improve the data rate at all, so I'm not sure what was going on there. Regardless, I can always disable data transmission on that first probe to save electric charge until the tracking station is upgraded, at which point the signal should be good enough to transmit that data. With that souring taste in my mouth, I went ahead with the landing of this new and improved probe. When all was said and done, we managed to land with a frankly concerning amount of fuel left over. Doesn't matter though, all that matters is that we are able to transmit all of these experiments and complete our contract. After a few minutes waiting for the probe to finish researching and transmitting, we can head back to the Space Center to collect our spoils. The contract provided a big chunk of change as well as some celestial body milestones. Also, despite the first probe being a bit of a dud, we still now have 2 out of our 3 probes landed that we need to complete our Minmus probes program. The last order of business is to unlock our much-awaited tech, Electrics. Not only does this tech provide us with a renewable source of power, it also provides us with upgraded batteries, upgraded probe core hard drive space, and a probe core that is much easier to integrate into most rockets than this weird ball thing we've been using. I also went ahead and purchased all of the available ScanSat parts, which may give you a clue as to what I plan to do next. With all that said and done, I would consider this a very successful episode, and I hope to see you around for the next video, assuming my brain wants to let me get around to it.